So, this is a book that I have not actually made my way through. I thought it would be interesting to read it for the first time with you guys. Or not exactly for the first time, because I've flipped through it a bit, but I have not made my way through it from beginning to end. And I am only going to go through the first chapter with you guys right now, but it's interesting because it is, well, I think I'll leave the intro sleeve to sort of explain the story behind this book, but, let me see. So, when Vladimir Nabokov died in 1977, he left instructions for his heirs to burn the 138 handwritten index cards that made up the rough draft of his final and unfinished novel, The Original of Laura. But Nabokov's wife, Vera, could not bear to destroy her husband's last work, and when she died, the fate of the manuscript fell to her son. Dmitri Nabokov, now 75, the Russian novelist's only surviving heir and translator of his many books, has wrestled for 3 decades with the decision of whether to honor his father's wish or preserve for posterity the last piece of writing of one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. His decision finally to allow publication of the fragmented narrative, dark yet playful, preoccupied with mortality, affords us one last experience of Nabokov's magnificent creativity, the quintessence of his unparalleled body of work. So, to those of you who do more regularly follow my videos, you probably have some idea of the small love that I have for Nabokov. I have done, I believe, only 2 videos of his works before, one being of an excerpt from Lolita itself, one of my first videos, and another being poems from Lolita. I've also talked a bit on the ideas of doing bits from his other works, but I had not made a more concrete decision to do that until now. And this is a book that I purchased, and much like Dmitri himself, I fought over whether or not to purchase this book, and then once I purchased it, I fought for a long time on whether or not to read it now that I had purchased it, because I still go back and forth on, wanting to honor his dying wish, even though, of course, it's already published, but because it was his dying wish to have this burned, there is a big part of me that thinks that I should not read it. But I've decided to forego that out of curiosity and out of, my love of his work, and especially, partly coming from the fact that I am a writer myself, this fascination of the idea of being a little bit closer to being in Vladimir Nabokov's mind. So, here we have, it's called The Original of Laura, or Dying is Fun. There's a picture of Nabokov himself, the same picture you pretty much see everywhere in his books. And let's see, The Original of Laura, or Dying is Fun, by Vladimir Nabokov. Now what they've done is, because as I mentioned it was 138 handwritten index cards, they've actually left copies of those index cards. Most of them are put in somewhat order, but I believe there are a couple that do not really work their way into the story. So the first one is this one, which is a series of words, which probably just, scratch paper, but efface, expunge, erase, delete, rub out. I cannot tell what exactly this says, but it has been scratched out. Wipe out, obliterate. He circled efface, so probably at some point he was looking for a synonym, but yeah. And because, as I mentioned, it is index cards, the first chapter consists of the first 20 or so index cards, and I have it marked at the end of that here, so we will know when it is coming. Another handy thing they have done is they've actually typed out exactly what he wrote up here below, so that makes it a little bit easier to read, but there we go. Chapter 1. Her husband, she answered, was a writer too, at least after a fashion. Fat men beat their wives, it is said, and he certainly looked fierce when he caught her rifling through his papers. He pretended to slam down a marble paperweight and crush this weak little hand, displaying the little hand in febrile motion. Actually, she was searching for a silly business letter, and not in the least trying to decipher his mysterious manuscript. Oh no, it was not a work of fiction, which one dashes off, you know, to make money. It was a mad neurologist's testament, kind of poisonous opus, as in that film. It had cost him, and would still cost him, years of toil, but the thing was, of course, an absolute secret. If she mentioned it at all, she added, it was because she was drunk. She wished to be taken home, or preferably to some cool, quiet place with a clean bed and room service. She wore a strapless gown and slippers of black velvet. Her bare insteps were as white as her young shoulders. The party seemed to have degenerated into a lot of sober eyes staring at her with nasty compassion from every corner, every cushion and ashtray, and even from the hills of the spring night framed in the open French window. Mrs. Carr, her hostess, repeated what a pity it was that Philip could not come, or rather, that Flora could not have induced him to come. I'll drug him next time, said Flora, rummaging all around her seat for her small, formless vanity bag, a blind black puppy. Here it is, cried an anonymous girl, squatting quickly. I just want to interrupt this to say how it's interesting that it seems very train of thought-ish. It seems to start mid-scene, as if, you know, at some point he must have planned to go back and flesh out the introduction to this scene, you know, between the woman and her husband, and then later on it cuts to her being out, and the hostess asking, you know, repeating what a pity it was that her husband couldn't go. And like I said, it's like clearly it's the rough draft, so of course I'm sure he intended to go back and flesh things out, but it's interesting to sort of see it written this way. Anyway, Mrs. Carr's nephew, Anthony Carr, and his wife Winnie were one of those easygoing, over-generous couples that positively crave to lend their flat to a friend, any friend, when they and their dog do not happen to need it. Flora spotted at once the alien creams in the bathroom and the open can of Fido's Feast next to the naked cheese in the cluttered fridge. A brief set of instructions pertaining to the superintendent and the chairwoman ended on, "Ring up my Aunt Emily Carr," which evidently had been already done to lamentation in heaven and laughter in hell. The double bed was made but was unfresh inside. With comedic fastidiousness, Flora spread her fur coat over it before undressing and lying down. Where was the damned valise that had been brought up earlier? In the vestibule closet. Had everything happened to be shaken out before the pair of Morocco slippers could be located, feebly folded in their zippered pouch? Hiding under the shaving kit. All the towels in the bathroom, whether pink or green, were of a thick, soggy-looking, spongy-like texture. Okay. Okay, so this bit at the end does not quite piece together as fluidly, but again, it feels very train of thought. Just, where was the dam? Where was this? It was there. Did this happen? And then sort of very scattered, like, thoughts. Sort of like it's, from her perspective and what she's thinking at the time. Also interesting, I know I've mentioned this in previous videos, and I think I can't go in a video on Nabokov without bringing up the fact that he had synesthesia, and I wonder if that affected his writing style in this sense at all. In previous videos I mentioned how it affected his use of metaphor, and for example in Lolita he describes the titular character Lolita as being brown-scented, and I wonder if, I don't know how entirely to explain this, but if because of his synesthesia he would at times feel compelled when he was writing something to suddenly start writing about something else entirely, if he had a certain sense or idea that came to him. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but, for example, he suddenly mentions all the towels in the bathroom, pink and green, thick, soggy-looking, spongy-like texture. If he was talking, writing about these things, and the slippers, and the valise, and then suddenly has an idea about these towels, and then decided to write down this detail that he could work into something else later. Anyway, let's keep going. Let us choose the smallest. On the way back, the distal edge of the right slipper lost its grip and had to be pried at the grateful heel with a finger for shoeing horn. "Oh, hurry up," she said softly. The first surrender of hers was a little sudden, if not downright unnerving. A pause for some light caresses, concealed embarrassment, feigned amusement, prefatory contemplation. She was an extravagantly slender girl. Her ribs showed. Conspicuous snobs of her hip bones framed a hollowed abdomen so flat as if to belie the notion of belly. Oh, that's good. To belie the notion of belly. Her exquisite bone structure immediately slipped into a novel. Novel? That feels like it should say navel. Maybe that's probably the joke he was trying to make there. Became, in fact, the secret structure of that novel. Besides supporting a number of poems, the cup-sized breasts of that 24-year-old impatient beauty seemed a dozen years younger than she, with those pale squinty nipples and firm form. Her painted eyelids were closed. A tear of no particular meaning gemmed the hard top of her cheek. Nobody could tell what went on in that little head. Waves of desire rippled there. A recent lover fell back in a swoon. Hygienic doubts were raised and dismissed. Contempt for everyone but herself advertised. With a flush of warmth its constant presence. "Here it is," cried what's-her-name, squatting quickly. "My darling Dushka Moya." Eyebrows went up, eyes opened and closed again. She didn't meet Russians often. They should be pondered. Masking her face, coating her side, pinaforing her stomach with kisses, all very acceptable while they remained dry. Her frail, docile frame, when turned over by hand, revealed new marvels. The mobile omoplates of a child being tubbed, the incurvation of a ballerina's spine, narrow mates of an ambiguous, irresistible charm. "Nature's beastliest bluff," said Paul de G., watching a dour old Don watching boys bathing. Only by identifying her with an unwritten, half-written, rewritten, difficult book could one hope to render at last what contemporary descriptions of intercourse so seldom convey, because newborn and thus generalized in the sense of primitive organisms of art, as opposed to the personal achievement of great English poets dealing with an evening in the country, a bit of sky in a river, the nostalgia of remote sounds, things utterly beyond the reach of Homer or Horace. That was a very long sentence. Oh my gosh. Readers are directed to that book on a very high shelf, in a very bad light, but already existing as magic exists and death, and as shall exist from now on, the mouth she made automatically while using that towel to wipe her thighs after the promised withdrawal. A copy of Glist's dreadful landscape, receding ovals adorned the walls, vital and serene according to Philistine flora. Auroral rumbles and bangs had begun jolting the cold, misty city. She consulted the onyx eye on her wrist. It was too tiny, and not costly enough for its size to go right, she said, translating from Russian, and it was the first time in her stormy life that she knew anyone take off his watch to make love. But I'm sure it is sufficiently late to ring up another fellow, stretching her swift, cruel arm towards the bedside telephone. She who mislaid everything dialed fluently a long number. You were asleep? I've shattered your sleep? That's what you deserve. Now listen carefully. And with tigerish zest, monstrously magnifying a trivial tiff she had had with him whose pajamas, the idiot subject of the tiff, were changing the while in the spectrum of his surprise and distress, from heliotrope to a sickly grey, she dismissed the poor oaf forever. That's done, she said, resolutely replacing the receiver. Was I game now for another round? She wanted to know. No, not even a quickie? Well, tant pis. Try to find me some liquor in their kitchen and then take me home. The position of her head, its trustful proximity, its gratefully shouldered weight, the tickle of her hair endured all through the drive, yet she was not asleep, and with the greatest exactitude had the taxi stopped to let her out at the corner of Haynes Street, not too far from, nor too close to her house. This was an old villa backed by tall trees. In the shadows of a side alley, a young man with a mackintosh over his white pajamas was wringing his hands. The street lights were going out in alternate order, the odd numbers first. Along the pavement in front of the villa, her obese husband in a rumpled black suit and tartan booties with clasps was walking a striped cat on an overlong leash. She made for the front door. Her husband followed, now carrying the cat. The scene might be called somewhat incongruous. The animal seemed naively fascinated by the snake trailing behind the ground. Not wishing to harness herself to futurity, she declined to discuss another rendezvous. To prod her slightly, a messenger called at her domicile 3 days later. He brought from the favorite florist of fashionable girls a banal bevy of bird-of-paradise flowers. Cora, the mulatto chambermaid who let him in, surveyed the shabby courier, his comedic cap, his wan countenance with its 3 days' growth of blonde beard, and was about to raise her chin and embrace his rustling load, but he said, "No, I've been ordered to give this to the madame herself." "You French?" asked scornful Cora. The whole scene was pretty artificial in a fishy theatrical way. He shook his head, and here Madame appeared from the breakfast room. First of all, she dismissed Cora with the strelitzias, hateful blooms, regalized bananas, really. Look, she said to the beaming bum, if you ever repeat this idiotic performance, I will never see you again. I swear I won't. In fact, I have a great mind. He flattened her against the wall between his outstretched arms. Flora ducked and freed herself and showed him the door, but the telephone was already ringing ecstatically when he reached his lodgings. And yep, that's the end of the first chapter. So it was difficult of what exactly to gather of this, but what I get from it is this woman, Flora, is having an affair. And that man who showed up at the end there was the man she was having an affair with. Also, probably the same man who got her the birds of paradise, which are quite pretty flowers, but not exactly the kinds of flowers you would buy for a woman. At least not the ones I've seen. We have some in my backyard. And those do not look like the kinds of flowers you would try to use to impress a woman. Another thing which, I believe it was mentioned that Nabokov's son translated many of his books. It's mentioned her, Flora here, translating from Russian, which was, as you might be able to tell from his name, Nabokov's mother tongue. He did, of course, learn English, and in fact he taught in many schools in the U.S. In later years, but when he first started writing, he started out writing in Russian, and it was later that he wrote in English, so that's why, even though Russian is his native language, these are all written in English, which I wonder then if translated versions of this are just the text and how much people who can't speak English would be able to get out of this, or especially with, everything being not quite fluid, I guess. There are lots of little bits that are mentioned, so a copy of Glandscape, which is mentioned and then dropped. Or, let's see, there's the description about her with her lover goes on for a while, but before that, there was a point where it seemed quite morbid. Yes, so mentions. Oh, I can't find it now. But basically, I don't know, it's quite interesting as it is. Because I haven't looked heavily into this, and because I haven't finished it, I can't exactly speak to what the whole story is about, or, any interpretations of it, but, given what I know, it seems very, especially a lot of the descriptions, the description of Flora and her body, the way she looks, the description of her encounter with the man she's having an affair with, is very reminiscent of the way he would describe, for example, Humbert's encounters with Lolita, and of course he's able to go into more detail with a I guess, less taboo scene, although, the topic of an affair is still taboo. It's certainly no Lolita. But at any rate, it's interesting to sort of see how, and again, it almost feels like being in his mind, like you can imagine him writing a bit and coming up with a scene, and then suddenly coming up with a small detail that he wants to add in somewhere else later and writing that down. And then, maybe at one point wants to use a synonym for to wipe out, and he might have, gone through a dictionary or a thesaurus or something and written down every word that sounded good until he came up with the word that sounded best in the sentence he was writing, or especially in a lot of these, they've had to sort of correct things. I guess not all that much of it, but there were definitely moments when they had to, correct his spelling, or there are parts where, he scratched out a whole line here. Let's see. Or, he says, it was the first time in my stormy life, and then he had to scratch it out and write her. I've seen a lot of bits like this that indicate that he might put himself in a more first-person perspective upon getting the ideas out there, and then translate it back into a third-person past tense, which is also quite interesting. Like, he gets into the mindset of the character and then steps back afterwards. And considering that a lot of these, little snapshots, the one I mentioned earlier with the towels and stuff like that, seem to be very first person, I wouldn't be surprised if that's how he sees it. Maybe not all the time, but at least part of the time. I also find it interesting that because of the cards, the back of each page is, and I'm pretty sure you can actually punch these cards out and actually go through the entire book with just the index cards, which, again, at the same time, it sounds very appealing to do, be more, I guess, faithful to the work as it stands, but I also don't want to be punching bits out of this. I want to keep it intact, but yeah. So yeah, thanks for sticking with me through this one. I know it's not exactly the same as most of the prose works that I've read you guys, given that it's neither a particularly popular piece, nor is it a complete and finished work. But thanks for sticking with me through something like this. Let me know what you guys thought. If this makes you more or less inclined to read his other works, or I don't know, if you would be interested in, if there was an unfinished work like this for another author who you happen to like, would you go out and purchase a copy and read it if you knew that the author did not want that work published? So, yeah. Because we didn't get that far into it, I don't think we quite got to a lot of the bits on mortality and stuff like that, but as I said, I'm sure that comes up a bit later. You can see we made it that far, and the book is this big. So, for those of you who are interested, I'm sure you can pick up a copy and work your way through it. And, if you have read it, let me know what you think. So, I guess that is it. And I will see you guys next time. Okay, bye.